the biggest thing for me was like, I'm so self-conscious. People are going to hate me. I'm scared that I'll say the wrong thing or that they'll say I'm wrong, even though I think I'm right. So I think what I sort of intuitively did was focus on the authenticity and focus on things that I knew well.
Louder than words. The first thing I want to do is like, I want you to take me back to, and this will be the first time in history somebody says, take me back to 2021, because like those were weird times. But I want you to take me back to like the summer, like right about now, 2 years ago. You were in the midst of joining SparkToro. And around that same time, you were really leaning into building up your personal brand. Because I remember like when we first got connected, you had me on the podcast at I always forget the name of the agency, Growth Machine. And like I would always see your posts in my feed,
Yeah.
right? But
Yeah.
then it became a point where I'm pretty sure like my mom would also see your posts in her feed. That's an exaggeration. But like just to illustrate how much you like your content and you as a personal brand sort of blew up and expanded right during that time. So like take me back to that point in your career, that summer, where the convergence of those two things were happening. You were making this big career change and teaming up with Rand and Casey at SparkToro, and then you were really leaning into your personal brand. And then just what was the motivation behind all of that?
I think at that point, that was like, I had just joined SparkToro
Yeah.
after meeting Rand and his wife, Geraldine DeReuter, at a restaurant where we met for the first time, and it felt like old friends meeting for the first time. And we just hung out for a couple hours, chit chatted, and then I ended up pitching them on a role at SparkToro, or them, well, slash Rand, right? And was like, well, I was employed at the time, so my reasoning was, well, I'm not desperate. Like if he says no, like that's fine. Like I still have a job and it's okay. But then he was like, oh, this is interesting. Let me think about this. Let me go back to my co-founder Casey and we'll talk about it. And then it actually happened. And I think I was just at this point where I was like, I can't believe this happened. Where I was like, what? Like I built up a personal brand of like, at this point, I don't know how many like Twitter followers I had. It was probably something like around 20 or 30,000. Um, and then I had like a dream job with SparkToro where we very much, care about work-life integration, um, mental health, like doing things that are easily scalable for us and our capabilities. Like it's very much, the a great culture fit, right? And I think I was just mostly just in a state of awe and shock of like not really believing where I was, but then also I think feeling some pressure, right? Like the marketing team at SparkToro is basically me and Rand. And when you work with Rand Fishkin, uh, well, one, he's the best marketer you could work with, right? He can say anything on the fly, can like speak to kind of any topic really, and if he can't, he'll fully admit it. So he's like the best spokesperson to have, and somebody who you can say like, "Hey, we need a quick video on this thing. Like, do you have time?" And he's like, "No problem." And then 20 minutes later, he'll send you a Google Drive link with a flawless 60-second video, and you're like, oh, okay, amazing. So we already kind of had that. But for me, as the person who's executing, I felt some pressure to be like, well, I have to be that good, or like I have to like bring out my inner Rand. So I did spend a lot of that time, like a part of the reason I really was focused on the personal brand part was really wanting to live up to my colleagues, like then I was like saying yes to all the podcasts and pitching myself to join. I think at that point I was recording like 4 podcasts per week. I didn't even know that many podcasts existed in our space. And like was just trying to churn out as much content as I could because I was like, this is what we do. Like this is how it
Right,
goes.
right. And
So
like
that's what it
what are
was
you
like a
this
couple
this
years
is
ago.
probably a loaded question, but what type of impact has Rand had on your outlook on creating content, right? Because you were a content creator before this and a really good one. But like you said, Rand is prolific in his own right
Mhm.
and almost feels like he invented a lot of the tactics that we all leverage. And so like what is it like to work with him? I
Yeah.
guess that's the most basic form of the question I'm trying to ask.
Yeah, I mean, I think one, he is probably even kinder than you might think he is, like, for as, like, kind, um, and nice as he is, like, in a podcast or on stage, he's even better as a human being, so there's that. Um, but also I think he's a very he's a very empathetic person and is very much
Yeah.
he very much respects everybody's boundaries, including his own. I guess I'll say that too, because he can create a ton of content. He can write a couple blog posts and record video and manage to join webinars and presentations and on stage conferences and podcasts and do all that in a week. Like it's kind of normal for him, but he doesn't expect anyone else to do that at that same level.
Right.
Right? He's not like, gosh, I did this. Why can't you do it? Like he would never say that. Um, so I think he's very respectful of those types of boundaries. But also he gets it, right? Like when I have writer's block and I'm like, I can't do this blog post, like I just can't do it, and he's like, he gets it. Like, and I think that's what's really important too when you work with certain marketing leaders. When they're if you're some kind of creator on a marketing team and you work with marketing leadership who isn't any kind of creator, you know, I think it's hard for them to have more empathy for when you encounter certain roadblocks or when you encounter writer's block or when you just encounter things like, I just can't like get creative today. I think it really helps to work with leadership who's also a creator in some way because they get it. And that's something that you sort of can't.
Right. Yeah, and it's less transactional that way, like produce the piece, right? Just do the thing. And they get that human side to creating, which is hard, right? On good days. Um which I mean, tell me more about you
Yeah.
and like that period and I think in terms of like marketing influencers and people that I know, I feel like I've never seen anybody go from where you were to like 100,000 that quickly. What do you like? What do you credit that to, and like what worked do you think during that time?
Oh, that's really interesting. No one's ever asked me that, like, it's especially in that way. Um, so there were a couple things, like, I did follow some of those, like, viral best practices of, like, make sure you have this attention-grabbing hook, like, you know, comment on other people's tweets so that you kind of and boost your own impressions, like, well, one, that was the first tip, like, I think early on, I spent more time commenting on other people's tweets or, like, LinkedIn posts rather than focusing on creating my own content, and then the other thing I did was I also focused on high signal to
Right.
noise. I mean, I get value is subjective, but like what's in my opinion, what I thought was something worth saying. I think some people might say like test a bunch of content and see what works. And I think I would directionally agree with that, but it's also not really what I did. Like I think I was still only tweeting like once to twice a day 5 days a week or 6 days a week. So I wasn't even tweeting every day. I was focusing more on what can I say today that I think is really worth saying, that I would stand by
Right.
for, you know, not forever, but like for a long time versus just tweeting about like a random hot take about a brand, right? So part of my reasoning my reasoning there was also just based on my own behavior as far as how I follow other people. So like my thinking was, well, I'll boost my impressions by posting on other people's like in my niche, like on their tweets. I will tweet some of my own stuff, but then I want anybody going to my profile to see like, oh, okay, this person tweets like every day, but she doesn't go off the rails and she
Right.
doesn't retweet a bunch of random stuff like 10 times an hour. Um, that was like my hypothesis or my thinking of like, because I don't follow back people who tweet more than like 3 times a day because it's just too much in my feed and I can't handle that. So, yeah, so that was kinda how I did it, and then I guess the other thing I would credit is honestly, I think a big part of it was I think there's a big appetite for people to see more diversity in
Yes.
the sort of creator thought leader space, and I don't wanna get all, like, high horsey about it or, like because it's not even about, like, let's all have a D&I strategy for our own consumption. It's not even that, but I think it was refreshing to people to see, like, "Oh, this is kind of interesting," like, we don't
Right.
normally see a lot of, like,
Right.
Filipino American marketers, like, talking about marketing. So, that's kinda what I think. I don't have any proof of that, but yeah.
From an outsider's perspective, what was one of the things that was impressive about your growth was that you could tell that you you didn't you didn't compromise on your own value. Like it never seemed like you were gaming anything. Like your content has been the same from when I first started following you till now. I mean, maybe there's more now, right? But like the tone of it and like your the level of thought that you could tell goes into this stuff. And I think that's the thing that's like one of the most impressive parts of it was that I don't know, it feels like you have conviction in the way that you do it and you're not going to change it. And um, another thing I feel like that I've seen from me, I just feel like there's a level of authenticity that you have that most people in marketing don't. And it just feels like there's a lot of talking heads. You don't feel like that. And so, I mean, I didn't have you come on the podcast just to build you up, but like that's as a friend, like observing, like that's how it's always felt to me, and it's like, oh, more people just see that now. That's awesome.
Yeah, I appreciate that, and I think well, that was also very intentional, right? Like, I had wanted to be a creator, like a blogger or something for the longest time, and I've had, like, all these little false starts. So I guess the other thing I would say is like I've been a journalist, food writer-ish, and then content marketer and marketing generalist for like my whole career, not just the marketing career. Like it spanned 10, 12 years before I ever started tweeting really. Maybe so it's also like well, I'm kind of old, but like I mean, I've been doing this for a long time, right? And I've so maybe it's I've spent more time wanting to do this and not doing it than I have actually been creating. And that has led
Right.
to so much overthinking, which I'm sure you can imagine. And so once I finally did start publishing publicly, the biggest thing for me was like, well, I'm so self conscious. Like, people are going to hate me. Like, I'm scared that I'll say the wrong thing or that they'll say I'm wrong, even though I think I'm right. So I think what I sort of intuitively did was focus on the authenticity and focus on things that I knew well, like things that I have either firsthand experience in because I've done the thing and I've seen the results, or
Right.
things I just know very well from like knowing a situation or a person or a given marketing function super well. And so that's what I write about, right? Like I don't I'll like you'll never see me write some kind of outside in looking case study of like, here's how Canva created their SEO like I have no idea how they did it. And like I'm not gonna pretend to know. And I would never do that because I didn't work at Canva.
No one else does either, unless you work at Canva and yeah, no one else does either.
Yeah, exactly. So like that's the kind of stuff I stayed away from. And so I think I mean, I guess to your point, I think people appreciated that, and I think where that helped me is it makes what I say more defensible, because when I talk about a thing that I've tested, and if somebody says like, "Well, that's not what I saw," I'd say, "Okay, like, then you're right, but, like, I'm also right."
It's I was gonna say that it's things that you can't be wrong about necessarily because it's your experience and it's your observations and you're not like stating absolute facts. So you can't necessarily be wrong. But other people could have different experiences, right? So it's like, yeah. How did this is interesting, like when
Mhm.
you said that, like this wasn't on my initial list of questions, obviously, but when you talked about that feeling of you thought about it for longer than you've actually been doing it, what what made you finally break through? And like what was it that finally inspired you, motivated you, reduced that level of fear? Like what was it?
So it was so in, like April, May 2020, right? The kind of early part of the pandemic, I was furloughed from my job along with like 90% of the company and, furloughed indefinitely. And at this point in my career, like I had been laid off, I had been unhappy in jobs, I've quit and had no plan. And the through line was I was always like uploading my resume into an ether, trying to network with recruiters, asking friends for favors. And I think I had just reached a point where I was just sick of doing that. Like it was exhausting. Like every time I was trying to job hunt, it was like, I can't believe I'm doing this again. This sucks. And everyone who's job hunting knows how much it sucks. So there was that. And then at the same time, I had applied for the role at Growth Machine, where the founder, Nat Eliason, had been the face of the company. And kind of part of the role was like, how do we make the company less dependent on his personal brand and just more like about the company? So part of it was, well, one, we can like hire a new person, right? I was that new person. And I think a lot of it too is just by the nature of the agency. Like when you work at an agency, like you're not going to spend a lot on marketing or advertising budget, right? So a lot of it was just organic marketing. Um, and also, like a lot of it was being inspired by Nat himself, right? He had built a personal brand. So I was sort of like, well, maybe I could do that too. Um, so the other thing was, so first it was being exhausted with a traditional job hunting like path. Two, it was trying to make marketing more sustainable for the agency, for Growth Machine. And then actually starting to see traction. And then like once you start to see some traction, it makes it more fun. And then it quickly kind of graduated to like, this is cool. Like I never want to do a traditional job hunt
And you
again.
haven't since, right? Like, I guess you wouldn't call SparkToro anything but traditional, right? Um, that's funny you say that because I had a similar experience when I started this podcast in 2015, um, and I got hired few episodes in. I got poached away from the job I was at. I was in the agency world, and I interviewed Justine Jordan, who was the head of marketing at Litmus, later became the VP of marketing. And I don't know, a month after I had her on the show, she reached out to me and said, "Hey, so we're actually looking for a head of growth, and we had a really good conversation. And like, would you entertain the idea of like coming up here and like meeting a few people?" And I was like, "Yeah." Um, and so my break into SaaS was because of this podcast. And I remember at that point, like, I wish I could say I had the foresight to like ahead of time to say like I never want to have a traditional job search again, but I didn't have to send in a resume. I didn't like everything already preceded me because they had listened to the podcast. They saw that I had built this up on my own. And from that point on, I was like, I never want to, I don't have a resume. And it's a point of pride. Like I don't have one. If somebody came to me and was like, "Oh, can you submit your resume?" I was like, I don't have a resume, and I don't plan on writing one. And so I relate to that. Like I could relate to that ambition to just like, yeah, I want people to come to me. I don't want to do this anymore.
What was the inflection point for you in going from Litmus to Databox? Like when I guess because I want to ask this in a better way than just why did you change jobs?
Well, there was layoffs. I mean, so they, I don't know about they had right when I had started, they had raised $49 million of private equity. Hence, them hiring a head of growth. They had really they they had grown to almost I think 20 million ARR like without any like almost not I don't want to say by accident, but they had such good product market fit. Like every brand is sending emails. Every brand knows like, oh, if a link breaks in an email or whatever like that's those are dollars, right? So every brand knows the value of emails. So testing your emails before you send them was like an obvious, especially for big brands, Nike, uh, Wall Street Journal, New York Times, like all these big brands, right? Nat Geo. So anyways, they had raised a lot of money, and I don't think the infrastructure was in place, maybe in terms of like leadership. I feel like there was a layer of leadership missing, um, that was then installed like a year and a half, 2 years in. And of course, when they came in, they had their own ideas on how they wanted to build out their teams and their companies. And so there was a lot of layoffs. So yeah, it was actually, I was actually a result of a layoff at that time. But then again, yeah, like I think I posted about like, hey, that I'm, basically on the market. And I had all my conversations were people who had reached out to me. One of them being, Pete Caputa at DataBox. So I didn't have to do the traditional job hunt,
Mhm.
send in resumes, hope people call me. It was just, relying on the network and the audience that I had been building up over the course of, I don't know, at that point, it would have been like 5, 6
Mhm.
years or something like that. So, um, yeah,
Yeah. Did you already were you already doing some good content then, or that come a little bit later?
no, that didn't come until 2020, until summer of 2020. Yeah.
Oh, okay. I didn't realize it was that new then, because I was an early adopter. Like, I was a subscriber, I think it was, like, July 2020.
No, I would say the first time I ever made something myself was the Louder Than Words podcast. And like you said, you kind of get bit by this bug that, like, you make something yourself, you put it out into the world yourself, it gets engagement or whatever, it makes money, whatever it is, right? And when that happens, I feel like a level of confidence is built up within you. Experience, all these things, right? That you could take to your job. It's valuable to your day job, but also like the next thing for me, I think the next logical step was I like the community aspect of it, and yeah, that's where some good content in the Patreon came from, and then later the free newsletter, and now the pod. It's like everything's coming full circle. Now the podcast, I had to bring this podcast back and like nest it underneath the good content brand because it means too much to me, because of like what it signifies in my own career. So yeah, that's a good question. Um, this is a dual podcast. Yeah, this is my show. I am the host now.
This is my show now.
Um, uh, Something interesting that we've talked about once when I did an interview for you, of you and Rand for the Good Content newsletter. I want to say back in like Q4 of last year, and it was by far the most read. Well, there's a lot more subscribers since then, so technically not the most the read edition of the newsletter, but the most well received. It was all about content brands and brands that aren't necessarily operating in a transactional mode all the time when they create content. And SparkToro, although it's a younger company in comparison to like maybe some of the other examples I used, um, I feel like embody that because Rand often talks about like traditional marketing attribution being BS, trust your gut more, and like all these things. And SparkToro, you guys publish. I use this example all the time. The holiday gift guide, which doesn't really tie back to SparkToro at all, right? It's just something that you both enjoy writing and putting together. And I don't know, like how does working within that sort of philosophy, like how does that influence the type of content that you create now, both personally for SparkToro? Like how is that? I don't want to say Rand, but just working within that sort of environment. Like how does that like just influence the content that you create?
Yeah, it's I feel like it's more fun, right? Because it kind of allows us to operate based more on vibes than anything else, which I know is a terrible, like, that's not good advice, but I guess vibes is really that's honestly though my informal way of saying it is based on audience research, right? Like, I mean, in the case of the food and drink guide, that really is something we think is fun. We have a lot of strong opinions about that we believe are well reasoned, right? Like we're very picky about what we buy. We're very passionate about food and drink, so like it's stuff that we think about a lot and have researched a lot just personally. So it feels like a natural extension of our interests, right? So there's that. But as far as the content in general goes, like, well, one, we don't have like an editorial calendar of like, great, this is based on these keywords and like this thing. It's more based on audience research, meaning like, what are the things that our customers are asking us a lot? What are the things that other B2B marketers are talking about a lot? What have been like some of the like high engagement or viral posts recently that we might have an
Yeah,
opinion on?
that would look on a slide
So
deck. Yeah, to
that's
sell it to
vibes,
your
right?
CEO vibes. Yeah,
Like,
I just
yeah.
good vibes.
Yeah, vibes.
Yeah,
But it's based on like things that are happening, right? Or if we get like the same question from a customer or SparkToro user, like the same question 3 times in a span of like 3 weeks, we notice that, right? We're like, "Oh, that's interesting. Like more people are asking about this thing. whether it's like a functionality in SparkToro, in which case we might break that out into a blog post that's more like, here's how to do this like marketing tactic or this research tactic in general, but here's also how you can do it in SparkToro. Um, so we pay attention to that. And where this works well for us too is that it's also driven by our interests, right? Like if we see like some kind of high engagement social media post that we might really agree with or might really
Yes.
disagree with, that's a fun place to start writing from, right? And then you have something to reference, and I think it makes it such that more people in our target audience are interested in consuming that content.
Right. A couple things I want to follow up on that you just said. The first one being that I find interesting. So you don't have like the traditional editorial calendar. Here's the keyword we're targeting, et cetera, et cetera. So what is like? Do you already know what you're going to be publishing next month? I mean, so talk about that. Like, it almost feels silly to ask that because that's not what you value, right? It's not like we have to hit this many posts. This it's more about when you have something to say. That at least that's how it comes across. Does that sound about right?
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, I think we try to do some things like we have regular publishing cadences. Like the audience research newsletter goes out every other Thursday. Like that's just how it is. So it's going to go out 2 days from now, which means I'm gonna start writing it today, finalize it tomorrow, good to go. Rand recently started a series called 5 Minute Whiteboard, which he aims to publish every Wednesday. Um, but it doesn't have to be Wednesday, but that's like the deadline that he hits because it probably helps him with his own workflow. So we have some of those things in place. um it's the blog posts that are really more based on when we have time slash when we're moved by something. And that one, like, it's the blog that has like the lead time is like a day or two, where it's like I'm working on a post right now about threads because we did a survey recent over the weekend, and I wanted to like share the survey results. And it started out as like an early guide to like not like an actual like strategy guide, but more of like, here's how to start thinking about a strategy if you are thinking about one. But then we took a step back and we're like, are people even thinking about this? So we thought it would be interesting to show like, hey, in this survey, like about 300 marketers took the survey. 70% of them haven't even claimed their company account yet. And that was roughly the statistic. So I thought that was interesting. It was something like over 70% of people who took our survey claimed their personal Threads account, but also over 70% did not claim their company account, which
I mean,
also
that makes
over
sense, right?
70% did
People
not claim
experiment
their company
before
account,
before
which
brands
I
come
thought
on,
was,
right? They're sort of more lagging.
yeah, I just thought it was interesting that I thought I was going to see more people who did claim the account, but just haven't posted yet.
Yeah, I guess claiming it and starting to engage with are two different things. So you would think, yeah, you would at least claim it. I noticed, like, because I think I was on there like the first night, which was was the most surreal experience because everyone on there, it's like walking into a party and being like, "Oh, you're here? Oh, hey, yeah. Oh, you came," and like the really early, and this doesn't happen that often anymore. Like 10 and 15 years ago, there was like a new social network. It seemed like every month, but this doesn't happen at this scale anymore. And so like the first few conversations, everybody was just like all the early people were just talking about the tool itself. Like they were just talking about threads, and the conversations were very like archaic from a social media standpoint. It was almost like, I'm eating pasta. How does this work? Like everybody's first tweet and everybody's first Facebook post. And so like I don't know, just had a really cool like going back to the vibes. Had a really cool vibe that first night. And I noticed because you were on there, and then like SparkToro was on there, so it must have been like you claimed the account. It must have been like
Mhm.
you claiming the account. I think that was the first brand I saw on there was SparkToro.
And
Yeah.
I think I posted like, yeah, like twice. But yeah, I claimed it a couple hours after mine. I think like when I claimed my account, I was around user like 300,000 ish. And then a few hours later, when I claimed the SparkToro one, it was like already over a million.
That's wild. Yeah, if you were like under a million and now it's like, what is it now? I don't even know. It's like
It's like over 150 million, I think. Yeah.
that's wild. So if you were under, like, that's crazy. That's like, yeah, they were still turning the lights on. Um, do you continue to log into it every day?
do. I think it's interesting to see how the conversation has already started to shift more towards like a Twitter-esque conversation of just people talking about things now, and the algorithm is improving. Yeah, I mean, it has been weird, but, like, I'm seeing more people
Right.
content from people I follow. It's not perfect, right? And, like, we'll have new features launching. Are you still logging in?
Yeah, I am. What's funny too is that like because it's integrated with Instagram and like my Instagram is more of like a personal account. So, like you could auto follow everybody and I didn't do that because I'm like a lot of these people
Mhm.
I went to college with or high school, like I don't post about
I
content
didn't,
on my
yeah.
Instagram, but a lot of them are following me. And so I'm like, this is going to be weird, like in a fun way. Like they've never seen me post about They're gonna be like, what is John talking about? Like, and so it's like, I saw somebody post about how it's like the first time that your personal and professional networks are like colliding in a way that could be interesting. um, but yeah, I'm still logging in because mostly I'm curious about it. Um, it always, I don't know. It's early. It feels cool. Um, but I have noticed, yeah, like how are you just posting what you post on Twitter or do you post anything different on threads that you don't post on Twitter? Like how are you?
I've been posting more about threads on threads, not so much on Twitter.
Yeah.
I've been cross-posting a little bit of the content just to see. And then I wanted to try testing, posting a thread. So I published a thread on Threads on Saturday. So it was a weekend, right? And I posted like I'm 8 months pregnant.
Yeah.
Um, I'm packing my hospital bag. Here's what I'm bringing. And then I had some screenshots of like the
Right.
products that I was bringing. And by the way,
Right.
this is all true. Like this
Right.
is what I'm actually doing. It's not like just a test. But I was curious about like I wonder if this will perform well because it's lifestyle-y content, which is kind of more Instagram-y than Twitter-y. Um, I have like over 1,000 followers, so like that's not nothing. And it performed very poorly. It got like 10 likes and like one comment. Um, but I'm interested in now I'm gonna try posting it
That'll
on
do well
Twitter.
there.
Maybe I'll do it on
Yeah.
Friday when it feels like more weekend vibey.
Yeah. It could have been the time too. Maybe the weekend, but who knows? Yeah.
Yeah, who knows? But I thought it was interesting to test because I was like, I would think that Threads would want to prioritize threads, like thread content. Maybe the content wasn't that good, like, that's fine too. But I had like this like very, very like vague hypothesis that like maybe this is what Threads wants. It's also lifestyle content. It's broadly relatable, I think. And I think I had enough novelty in there that I thought was worth looking at. Like my list wasn't like I'm bringing my toothbrush. It was like like a particular type of shirt for the baby, like the side snap shirts. Those are great.
Most things that snap are not. And but yeah, um, I'm zippers all the way. Uh, but yeah, that is interesting. I don't think the algorithm knows what it is yet, so it'll be interesting to see how it changes as you go. But it is like, yeah, it's an exercise in humility because yeah, right now it's so early that you'll post something on there and nobody will engage at all, and you'll be like, okay, nobody cared about that. And um, but it's almost like Meta is so big that it can't fail. But I also don't think Twitter's going anywhere either. So it'll be interesting to see like how that
Mhm.
shakes out. The one other thing I wanted to ask you about was like what has to happen for you to be inspired to put pen to paper on anything. Proverbial could be a recording, could be a Twitter thread. Like I'm, I'm interested in creators like you who are governed more about like what interests you than necessarily like keywords and stuff like that. I'm interested in like what criteria for you needs to be met um, for you to feel like, all right, this thing that I want to make is necessary, and I'm going to create it.
This used to be having a deadline. Like it used to like what used to be the effective forcing function for me was we publish on Thursdays. That's just what we do. Um that doesn't work for me anymore because I'm going and I don't even do this on purpose. It's just kind of like how I'm thinking now. It's some combination of novelty and clarity of like is this idea, this concept whatever this topic, is this novel for the audience? And can I communicate this in a clear way? Which makes it a lot harder to publish.
And you have to spend a lot of time thinking about it to get to the point where it's clear. At least I do, right?
Yeah, for sure. And then there are times that I will be thinking about a given idea for months on end, and then suddenly it'll get published one day. Like last year, like around this time last summer, I published my blog post on zero click content, and it was something that like I had in my I had it as a concept in my content marketing 201 course where I was teaching concepts about it like as early as January 2022. And I had just never like written it down. And I mentioned it in passing to Rand in conversation. He was like, "What did you say?" I was like, "Yeah, like zero click content. It's content that like is native to the platform." Da, 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 da. And he was like, "That's interesting." He's like, "Tell me more." And so I kind of just I was like, "Yeah, because the algorithms and this and this." And he was like, "You should write this as a blog post." I was like, "I don't think this is a blog post. I think that was a sentence." And he was like, "That's a blog post. Please write it, okay?"
Blog post is made up of many sentences, so that's a good start.
And I was like, "I guess so." And then it took me a couple days, but then once it was out, it was out. And so I guess what I'm calling out was like it was an idea that I was thinking about for like maybe 6 to 9 months before I actually wrote it down as a blog post, which took me a couple days, and then it was out. So, yeah.
Do you think that feels like it was probably necessary, right, for you to clarify it in your mind and make sense of it in a
Yeah.
way that ended up, right, like re- being able to be relatable to a lot of people? Do you think like that's an important piece of just the whole journey?
For me, it is, yeah. I think having the time to just percolate on it, turn the idea over in my head a bunch of times, and then, like, even just subconsciously looking for examples of like, concrete examples of the concept, so that once I start writing it down, like 'cause, like, for when I started writing that blog post, the first draft that I had was pretty close to the final draft, right? So it wasn't even like, here's an outline. I don't know what to do next." It was like, "Oh, here's the blog post. It's like 95% done. Rand, can you review it?" So I guess I would say it could take me forever to write something, but once I start writing it, it's already the near final version.
Because you've spent so much time already iterating on it in your head. I had a similar experience with the whole concept of content brands.
Mhm.
It was something I had been thinking about for a long time, but I never really knew how to describe it. Was it's like there's brands like Profitwell and Wistia and SparkToro and Drift in its early days, who like they create this following of people who may or may not even be buying from them, but they're recommending the tool because of the content. And like I was like that with Wistia. I used Wistia or I didn't use Wistia. I didn't pay for Wistia. Like it took me 5 6 years, but I would recommend it to other people. I would talk about Wistia. I would reference Wistia because their content was so good, and I was essentially a customer of their content. And I don't know. I've been noodling on that. Like I would think about it when I was on runs. Like I'd be exercising, and it would pop into my head. And then finally, like content and the definition, like brands that create content so good that they build a loyal following, even from people who might not ever buy from them. That just like came into my head, and I was like, that I think it's still not perfect to me, but like that communicated what I was trying to say. And I don't think I could have done if I just was like, all right, sit down and write the blog post about that initial spark of an idea. I don't know that I would have been able to communicate it or articulate it. And worse, I don't know if I would have kept exploring it because I'm like, all right, it's on paper now. It's down. Next thing. Like I don't know that I would have kept exploring it. And I think that's where the magic happens. Like if you hadn't kept exploring and that zero click idea, used it in your course, kept riffing on it in your own mind, and then what became of zero click content. Like I was at Databox, people would reference that all the time that didn't even know you. They'd be like, oh, zero click. I was like, and I'd be like, oh, like Amanda Natividad. It's like, oh, who's that? I was like, that's who coined it. Like that's who coined the phrase zero click content. So it's fun. Like, and I know not everybody has that luxury, right, to spend that much time noodling on an idea, but um, yeah, I think that piece for me too. I relate to that. It's an important part. I need to clarify it in my own head before I could really make sense of it and like make it a thing.
Totally. And well, maybe the things that we are intuitively doing is kind of chopping it up into smaller examples. Because maybe along the way, as you were thinking about content brands, you were already bringing up, like, hey, Profitwell is really good at this. Here's how Profitwell did that. Like, here's how they use data to convey, like, this value proposition, where you might not be thinking like it's a lead up to content brands, right? But, like, along the way, as you're kind of building towards that, you start just kind of naturally thinking about tangentially related ideas, and those kind of surface first.
Exactly. Yeah. I think being in tune with that is probably the most important thing we could do as creators, is like being in tune with like what's the bigger story happening. At least that's what I've tried to do now. It's like, yeah, like you just said, those examples you keep going back to. Why? What's different about them? And yeah, and I think SparkToro was a good example. I think companies I reference as examples, it feels like the brand embodies like that. Like one thing that's I don't know what the right word is. Funny to me is like, how often do you guys talk about SEO? Like Rand Fishkin, right? Like, like what was the metric he sort of coined at Moz? Was it domain rank or domain authority, whatever it is?
He has the patent on domain authority.
Right. So it's like Rand is like, one could say like the godfather of SEO, right? Or whatever you want to say, right? But it doesn't sound like that's a huge part of the strategy.
No, it's not. I think a big part of it is like, yeah, we like logged into Moz, or I logged into Moz and was like, what are some keywords we can go after? And like a lot of it is like, well, I mean, we can't just like rank for marketing. Like, and then I started looking for other keywords and like things like audience research, or like no one's really searching for that yet. So that's one tough thing. I think we care more about yeah, we care a lot about branded search, like people looking for us. Um, and I will share this, a little bit random. In that first lunch that I had with Rand, in which I pitched to join the team, at the very end of our meeting, I was like, "By the way, I'm not really that good at SEO." I just like kind of had this moment of panic. I was like, "I'm not really that good at it," and he was, "We'll be fine. Like we're good." He's like, "That's okay." I was like, "Okay, I just thought you should know that." Like it's
Feel like I should get that out of the way. Yeah, to you. Yeah. I mean that's interesting though, that the tool itself is novel. And so the search volume, right, maybe isn't, although you could argue like audience research, like people are, that's not a new idea, or like but yeah, that's interesting. You don't have but I love that too. And especially now I've talked to a bunch of SaaS founders that are concerned about what the hell is going to happen with SEO, with AI, and commoditizing like the traditional like how-to post and the educational content. And again,
Mhm.
I don't think it's going to go to zero like a lot of these influencers like to pontificate about, like, oh, educational content is going to go to zero. What are you preparing? I don't think
Mhm.
anything ever goes completely away unless it's like Google Glass or something like that. Um, that went away. And what was their social network? Google what 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 was it called? Google Plus. Yeah, those went away. Those went to zero. But like I don't think it's going to go to zero. But there's a lot of concern about it, and so yeah, it's and I think the companies that invest more in like the content brand stuff, like Spark, I just think they're already going to be miles ahead, and people follow you like I don't use SparkToro yet, but I follow the content. I'm a fan. I would refer it to other people, and I think that's the idea. And I don't know. There's a few handful of brands out there doing it right, and um, it's fun to follow those. And those are the ones that inspire me personally. So yeah. So, but it's super interesting to me, the part about SEO and it not being. I think I asked Rand that as part of that newsletter series, and he said something similar, like, "Well, there's not a ton of search volume yet, and also your tool
Mhm.
like relies more on like the whole value prop of the tool is like leveraging audience research to see like who the folks are in your space that are talking about certain things, like, so you're kind of like, I hate the term, but like dog fooding, right? That's the approach you're taking, right? More of like the research element and like using your tool to sort
Mhm.
of prove out like that's the direction rather than SEO. So that makes sense. um but still, it's fun. It's yeah, it's a little wild to think about, but makes it more fun, I'm sure, because um, having a spreadsheet full of keywords to create content around wasn't inspiring for me, and I'm sure it's for many marketers feel the same way. So
Yeah, and I mean, like, there's also a time and a place for that, right? Like, sometimes maybe if you're in a very well-defined niche, it's fun because there have been, I mean, it's not to say that I don't think that that's valuable, right? It just isn't the approach we're taking right now, but, you know, there's still value in it. Just depends on your situation, depends on your niche, depends on your marketing strategy, all that stuff.
depends. That's the advice every marketer should give everybody. Will this work? Should I do that? It depends. It depends, yeah. So we'll leave it at that. Amanda, thank you so much for coming on and helping me kick back off the Louder Than Words podcast. Couldn't think of anyone better to have as like the new first guest after all these years. So thank you for coming on and helping me kick it off.
Oh, thank you for having me. I do have a final question for you.
Oh, let's
Since
do
this
it.
is since this is now my show, I would like to ask you what do you think you're gonna do differently this time with louder than words than you did the first time around?
So the funny
Or
thing is,
louder
like,
than
the
words
premise of the
than you
show
did the first time
is even
around?
more, I think, acute now. Like the challenge. Like back then, I launched the show thinking like most companies were just publishing words, and great marketing was louder than words, right? It's not just writing 500 words or certain keywords or optimizing, right? There's more than that. There's a certain level of magic that needs to happen in what you create, and it goes beyond just the words on the paper. Now, all these years later, people are writing scripts for podcasts, scripts for video. AI is literally commoditizing words. You don't even have to write them yourself. And so I think the premise of the show is even more, I don't know, relevant now. In terms of what I'm doing differently, I think the tilt, the angle is going to focus more on content. Back then, I had Austin Kleon, who's, I mean, one of my favorite authors, Steal Like an Artist, Seth Godin. I mean, they're all content creators, but the focus back then was more on like company growth, like Jason Fried from Basecamp and talking about like how they grew Basecamp and the things that worked. I was a head of growth at the time at a SaaS company, so that's where my conversations naturally went in that direction, growing SaaS companies. Now it's going to be more zeroed in and focused on content, which is my passion, my wheelhouse. As I've grown in my career, the thing I like to be focused on the most. Early on in my career, I was like, I don't want to be known as like the content guy. I'm a head of growth now. I'm a head of marketing now. I do so much more. That meme, the dimwit meme? That's like you use Apple Notes, and then in the like low IQ uses Apple
Yeah.
Notes. In the middle, you're using Notion and all these different things, and then high IQ, you're back to Apple Notes. Like I feel like my career has followed that trajectory, whereas like low IQ, like I'm just a writer. Middle CRO, I'm a head of growth. I'm like I do all these things. I'm not just now. I'm like high IQ at the end. I'm like I'm a writer. Like I'm a content person at heart, and I was a writer long before I was a marketer. So yeah, the show is going to focus primarily on like the content brands create, and specifically brands like SparkToro, people like you that are just doing things differently, and you're creating content, creating work that's louder than words. So I'm sure that'll get more refined over time, but that's kind of how I'm thinking about it right now.
That's awesome. I'm so excited to watch this journey unfold.
Yeah, thank you for being a part of it, and we'll have to have you on again once the premise gets even more sharp. But I appreciate you coming on and being the first.
Yeah.
All right, first one's in the books. Louder than words.